and welcome to the Oppo Live Beyond series, where we look at the lives and stories of ordinary South Africans who have turned their challenges into unique opportunities. Hi there, I'm Yavi Madurai. I'm the founder of I Am South African, an active citizenry advocacy body that looks at how do we get citizens to start taking responsibility for our country, our way, for our future. Today we're talking about, positioning and branding South Africa from an attraction of investment perspective, and how we're going to look at this economic recovery that everyone keeps on talking about. So I'm very, very privileged to have all three of you in studio with me today. And if I may start at the end, please, Charmaine, just tell us who you are and where you're from, and what your hope for South Africa is as we move forward.
So, Charmaine Houvet, I am the chair of Young Leaders Connect, and basically it's an institution or a sister association of International Women's Forum of South Africa, and we actually assist, build and develop the next generation of ethical female leaders. I also had the privilege of serving as chair of the President's Fourth Industrial Revolution, but particularly the work that looked at the sort of policy and the regulatory sort of sectors. I actually chaired that working committee. My hope for South Africa is that we start to actually address this barrier when it comes to issues around female empowerment. I think it's too often that narrative is told that, the issues globally, if there's any tragedy, if there's a pandemic, whatever happens, it's women and children who are at the center of any tragedy or any pandemic. So the more associations like International Women's Forum, Young Leaders Connect, and a host of others that come together to support critical initiatives like the President's GBV1 Fund that sought to actually put in financial instruments, and not just around counseling and speeches, but actually putting down real hard funds to ensure that women get access to finances, and also to ensure that women are educated and that they are able to form part of the economy. That then starts to address this huge social ill around something like a GBV. So my hope is that moving forward, we start to see more women and more youth pop up in board leadership positions, in CEO positions, in organizations, leading companies, they top entrepreneurs. So I think it is possible, and this is why the work I do becomes so essential to forming part of that formula.
I love the ethical leaders part. I don't think we focus enough on that. We're so focused on leaders, develop leaders. The ethical is very, very critical. Avon, tell the people who you are.
I'm Avon Middleton. I'm publisher and director of Top Gear South Africa. We are an automotive publication. We work in the automotive and motorsport space. And I also run Clipping Point Media, which is a content and advertising agency. We also work in the automotive and motorsport space. So yeah, I'm a member of the media, essentially.
And we know what you're passionate about. You didn't have to say it. We knew what you were passionate about.
I'm passionate about growth.
There we go. So what is the hope?
I'm passionate about closing the gap between the youth and, I suppose, the young professionals. I think that, you know how people go, okay, I'm out of school or I'm out of varsity. Okay, now what? Okay, you want a job, but you got no experience. Yeah, but I need a job to get experience. I'm passionate about closing that gap.
Cool. That in itself says a lot. Sonwabise, please tell us who you are and where you come from. I know the list is long, but tell us.
Sonwabise Mzinyathi. I chair an organization called the South African Women in ICT Forum, and I'm part of the Financial Committee for the Women's Economic Assembly. I have a very big passion for go-to-market strategies and having companies align their interests with shared value and with government interests, because if we don't get that right, we kind of become mismatched in how we're creating economic opportunities. I'm really passionate about the economic and financial inclusion of women, but in real terms, in real tangible terms, where we see an actual growth in terms of participation, but also in terms of ownership, so that women start to become more empowered to make their own decisions, and that we drive equity in the real sense. And not just in a quality sense, which can be mismatched, to his point, where you say, but I'm creating this program for you, but this program actually does not close the gap, because the gap is that big for us to close. So yes, in the next decade, I'm supporting the AU with closing the gap on women's economic and financial inclusion.
A lot is happening in South Africa at the moment when it comes to where we are at and our status in terms of economic recovery, but also trying to attract investment into the country, into the continent, on behalf of the continent. So many different things happening. So we've got load shedding, that is a swear word in 11 official languages and even in the unofficial languages. We have got Banyana coming home to huge celebrations, and focus on the word huge, because up until a tour broke out the last couple of days, a huge payout for them was 55,000 for their bonuses. So we had discussions around that and about gender equality playing out. We have had discussions, or rather some confirmation, some not so much, in terms of F1 possibly being on the South African calendar, or the other way around in 2023, but definitely the Clipper race, the yacht race, round the world yacht race that's coming to South Africa. We've got the AFCFTA, which is important to us because we're the most industrialized nation on the continent. So investment, as far as that is concerned, becomes important. And finally, this all comes together because we host, or our president's brainchild is the SA Invest conference that happens annually for the past couple of years. And we've been raking in quite a few 100 million over the last, actually it should be close to billions now. So there's all these things happening from a South African perspective, but we are not seeing it in terms of the numbers for employment or economic growth and those kind of things. So let us just have this conversation today to kind of pull some of those strings to see what happens in the world of investing in South Africa for economic recovery to truly happen, and for South Africans to start to feel hope, confidence, and most importantly, to be able to have money in their back pocket, in terms of that prosperity that we are still looking for all these years later. So thank you so much for joining us in studio at the Oppo Studios today. I want to start with Charmaine. You've just come back from Silicon Valley and all kinds of discussions happening around technology. Now, give us some insight in terms of how South Africa is viewed from a technology perspective, obviously from an investment perspective, but how is South Africa viewed from the technology sector globally, shall we say?
Got it. Thanks, Yavi. So from a technology perspective, I believe that many of the players across the sort of ICT spectra have done a lot of hard work in terms of putting the right policies in place, leading and driving the correct regulation to ensure a competitive enough industry. And I do believe, having myself been in the sector for quite a long time, that we're better off than we were before. Are we there yet? Absolutely not. We still have a very, very long way to go. And I'll give a very basic, straightforward example that has been in the media over a number of years. We know as a country we've struggled since 2016 to finalize the spectrum debacle and the spectrum debate. And finally, during COVID, I also believe that as damaging and devastating as COVID was, it started to get the right people around the table to put together the correct ingredients and the formula to put pressure on decision makers and policy makers and regulators to start to drive the entire spectrum process forward. Because if you think of prior to COVID and then the COVID period, so many of us were actually catapulted into digitization. So many of us were dragged. Not many went willingly. And because many organizations were dragged, they then had to find alternative ways and means of keeping people connected, enabling online learning, enabling remote health, and various other aspects of remote. So whilst we do have some of the most well thought through policies, processes, regulations in place, it's political will that prevents us from implementing upon them. So even as one of the former members of the President's 4-Hour Commission, I chaired the policy and law reform of working group. There was not a single policy that we failed to find or come across. They were all there and they were very well articulated. They had some of the brightest minds across the continent who gave input into those policies. And I do believe that an area that we do fall short on, not just in the technological space, but various other sectors as well, is to take those well-crafted, well-thought-through documents and then just have the political will to bring the right stakeholders around the table and execute.
100%. I want you to just very briefly explain what spectrum means to somebody, standing on the side of the road, a normal South African. What does spectrum mean to them? The fact that spectrum has gone through quite a controversial process, status, it's been, it's become something else. What does that mean? What does spectrum, the release of spectrum, mean to that person, to a normal South African?
So, great question. If you think during the very height of the hardest of lockdown, when we were at level 5, we realized that there was so much which was restricted. First and foremost, and the most crucial and critical one, especially for many of our relatives and people, and for the ordinary South African who lives in a rural area or lives in a township area, the thing that impacted us the most and kept thousands, hundreds of thousands of children out of school was the ability to be educated and to connect remotely, to continue their education at the height of lockdown. So this was not the very same sort of prohibition. It was not the very same sort of issue that was faced by, an example, somebody like me, who could easily log on to my device, access broadband, and continue remote working as per usual. And what that would mean to any ordinary South African is the ability to be able to log on with children, even workers who live in remote areas, to be able to log on and to continue interacting as per normal, remote working, remote learning, etc. And a more real example that became quite relevant for me during lockdown was if we were hosting a conversation or we were hosting a roundtable discussion or even an entrepreneurship session, the most heartbreaking thing to see as a citizen are conversations in the chat group that says, unfortunately, I have to log off. I cannot continue listening in or receiving this knowledge or receiving this wealth of information because I've run out of data. And what many of the operators have been saying over a long period of time is, if we are allowed access to additional spectrum or licensing, I can then bring down the cost to communicate. What does that mean, the cost to communicate? It means that more youngsters, more entrepreneurs, more startups can stay for a longer period of time in training sessions.
So I was very interested the other day. I walk past the screen because I choose not to watch the sport channel, but the sport channel is on in my house for various reasons. One reason in particular, and there is a documentary by the Qataris about the road to 2022 World Cup. And all they are referencing, I sat there in awe watching this, because all they were referencing was South Africa and how we changed the game forever. So clearly it's something we do well. It's something we are able to bring, bold South African flavors and unapologetically so. When you look at the sector that you are in, so from a Top Gear perspective, but just in general, when you look at what the potential of this sector holds to attract investment, but also to be able to start contributing in a massive way, because we have that capacity to the economy and to help the economy recover, What does that look like for you and from that sector specifically?
Sure. So it's very exciting. I think we have a very colorful nation, and I mean that in the sense of we're diverse. We have multiple languages, multiple cultures. We're this melting pot of culture, and we're also brought together by sport. We've seen that, throughout our democracy. Sport is something that brings those colors together. And I also think that we have pretty good infrastructure when it comes to being able to run a large-scale event, sporting event included. We're also, more in the Top Gear realm. We're also a car-mad country. We love automotive, we love cars, and as much as we love sport, within that is the world of motorsport. And unfortunately, we've seen, motorsport kind of have less and less media coverage, less and less popularity because of the prohibitive cost of it. It's quite an expensive thing to get into locally, but it's also quite an expensive thing to buy. TV licenses, they're expensive. They're incredibly expensive. So we've seen less and less of that. But I think there's now this resurgence, and there's this excitement, and there's this belief that actually, bringing the right people together, we can actually get to a point where we were before. So I think we're a nation that is incredibly talented, both in an industrial sort of capacity, also in the sport itself. I'm sure South Africa's motorsport history is also quite illustrious and quite colorful. So I think we're getting to a point where it's starting to make sense. Some of the questions around the investment that it takes to host large-scale sporting events have been in the media, people questioning it. But I certainly think we have the infrastructure, we have the ability, we have the capacity to do these sorts of things. And a case in point, like a Formula One, is, I think, given the right deal and the right term of the deal, we can really start to see 5-year, 10-year investments into a sport which has huge legs for, not just in the short term. The event is one thing, but there's also long-term effects. And of course, you bring one large-scale event, it inspires other large-scale events to come. So if we do a Formula One, I can tell you MotoGP is going to be chomping at the bit to come. And then, more and more will happen. And yeah, it's quite exciting. And I think as a nation, we're ready. There's really nothing holding us back except that confidence to say, well, let's actually do this.
So when we look at it, it's confirmed, it's not confirmed, there's speculation, there's not speculation, everyone has their opinion. Where are we at with the F1? Let's just get it out once and for all. Where are we at with the F1?
The idea of Formula One coming to South Africa has been in negotiations for some months now. It's close. Where we're at the moment is Formula One is in agreement. As far as I know, the money is there for it to happen. So in terms of the business model, Formula One gets a fee, which is quite expensive. I think it's $35 million US. So that's for Formula One. But then, of course, there's the promotion fee, which is, bringing the event, all the logistics, the promotion of it, the marketing of it, etc., etc. I believe there's money for both. It's there. We are waiting for a deal to be signed between the promoters and the venue, which in this case is Kyalami, illustrious racetrack that used to host Formula One. It's got a great history and a great story, but the deal hasn't been signed. So where we're at the moment is Formula One's in agreement. They've put it into their provisional calendar for 2023, but it's not signed. The deal's not signed. So it's close, and I believe they're still in negotiations. But right now, as I sit with you, it's not coming officially. There's a lot of speculation. There's media houses in Europe that have put it onto their websites saying it is coming because Formula One has it on their provisional calendar. But Formula One's planning 5 years in advance, 10 years in advance, they're signing deals. So it makes sense to put it on the provisional calendar because they want it, all the drivers want it, all the teams want it. And there is a deal that is officially being negotiated. Stefano Domenicali from the FIA was here Formula One's been coming to Kyalami, for the last year, coming to visit, coming to understand what needs to be done to the track, coming to check on infrastructure, which, it's a massive operation. So yeah, as it stands, it's very close, but there's no signature, and we all know how important the signature is.
Ink on paper means it is real. Before the ink on paper is not real. So we will all live in hope to see what happens. Miss Sonwabise, you are, you run around the continent. You have been running around the world in various roles, whether it be global citizen, whether it be London Stock Exchange, whether it is as chair of SA Women in ICT. Give us a picture of what and how South Africa is positioned from a continental perspective when it comes to when people want to invest, when people want to look at South Africa comparatively so. How do they see South Africa? What do they see about South Africa that maybe we're a bit too close to see South Africa for?
There's been a change in information and the information that we are providing. We've always been a country that provides information, but investors, remember, when they're looking at a country, they understand that there's risk, but as long as they have enough information to be able to manage that risk, then they're able to come in and make the decisions that they need to make regardless of the country's situation. And unfortunately, some of the things that have been happening on the continent is that because there's just not enough information in comparison to South Africa, it's made it quite difficult for the rest of the continent to get as much investment as South Africa gets. And in the same respect, the continent looks then to South Africa to test some of these investment strategies, to say, okay, how would a VC work in my situation? How would a PE work? How would an impact fund work? What do I need to attract that kind of investment? So what has helped us really this past 2 years, COVID, has been access to information, but also the change in government strategy to be very intentional about attracting investment into South Africa. You spoke of the president's investment strategy. You would have seen 2 weeks ago, the president hosted a Black Industrialists Summit. We hosted a Women in Finance Summit, all geared towards really ensuring that we are positioning the country again to be the investment choice intentionally and not letting it to play to chance. So there's really been a big shift, both information and then as well as the intention behind it. And I think in as much as we've had an erosion in our systems and in our institutions, we've had one or two very strong institutions that were never broken. And one of them is the Reserve Bank. And although it's a very old industry, very old organization, the Reserve Bank has managed to, over time, ensure that they are proactive about the kind of policy testing they are doing to ensure that new technologies are able to thrive whilst also mitigating risk for the country.
And that's it for this episode of Live Beyond with Oppo. Thank you to our amazing guests for joining us, and thank you to Oppo for creating a platform to connect and inspire. Follow Oppo